It's been another big week of Disney Lorcana tournaments, including an officially organized tournament in Ravensburger, Germany, featuring 465 players. So let's dive straight into those deck lists. So first up, as always, we're going to start off with the meta breakdown, and a little note to say that this breakdown taken from Inkdecks doesn't include every tournament result from the last 7 days. In fact, there's big power outages in Portugal and Spain, Spain being where Inkdecks team are hosted. So that is impacting some of the data, but we do have a pretty good idea anyway. And we do see that the big three are fighting it out for the top spot there between Steel Song, Ruby Amethyst, and Ruby Sapphire. So these three were the most represented decks last week, and it's the same this week. One interesting thing to note is Ruby Amethyst at this point is kind of, there are two versions which we're going to look at, but the nuance of that isn't represented in Inkdecks. So they're kind of all bundled into this, but there are kind of two archetypes, very similar, but there are differences specifically around the evasive side of things. After that, we see Blurple in 4th place with over 10% of the meta share, and that is a slight improvement from last week, it taking the 4th spot place from Amethyst Steel. After that, we do see a good representation of other decks. We see Amethyst Steel. We see both versions here, so the mid-range version, which has got a few more of those removal actions, and also the aggro version, which is more based around the aggressive approach and generally features dock. We see a few different discard decks. We see Emerald Steel discard, which put up some good results this weekend. We see Amethyst Emerald discard, which is continuing to do really well. But we also saw Emerald Amber discard starting to reappear back in the metagame. So the metagame does continue to be very diverse. Of course, we do see that convergence around those 3 or 4 main decks. And then in terms of the tournament top 8 we're going to be looking at, so there was, of course, as I mentioned, that big tournament hosted in Ravensburger, Germany by the Disney Lorcana team, which featured 465 players, we believe. We have the winning deck list for that, but we don't have the rest of the deck list quite yet. But even so, it's going to be really interesting to look at that top 8. After that, there was a really big tournament actually in our backyard here in Montreal, hosted at the Randolph Rosemont. It was a 2K event with 128 players, which I'm informed is the second largest Disney Lorcana tournament hosted in Canada. There were many good players there, including Sailor. After that, we have the Lucky Llama Showdown hosted by Shark Gaming, a 97-player event which featured the likes of Zan Syed and Moshamblin, and Disney Lorcana Stockholm Open hosted by Nordic Inkrealm in Sweden, 89 players. So looking at those top 8 breakdowns, of course, let's start with the big one first. And actually quite an interesting one to look at, because really that top 8 was dominated by Amber Steel, who took 4 places there. We see 2 Amber Emeralds. Of course, the event was taken by the Chernadog Amber Emerald, and then also 2 Ruby Amethyst. So very interesting how little variety there is in this top 8. Steel Song, the most represented deck in the top 8, and of course taken by Chernadog in the top 1. For a little bit more diversity, we have the top 8 now at the Randolph Rosemont 2K. The event was taken overall by Emerald Steel, but we do see some really good variety in the top 8. We see 1 Ruby Sapphire, 1 Amethyst Sapphire, 1 Amber Steel, 2 Amber Amethyst, and 2 Amethyst Steel. And it was Amber Amethyst who took 2nd spot, and Amethyst Steel who took 3rd. We saw equally nice variety at the Lucky Llama tournament, so it was taken by Amethyst Steel, but not the Amethyst Steel you might expect. It was taken by a Jafar Wheel version, which we're going to take a look at. I'm very excited to look at that deck list. We also saw 1 Amethyst Emerald in the top 8, 1 Ruby Sapphire, 1 Amber Steel, 2 Amethyst Sapphire, and 2 Ruby Amethyst. And then the last top 8 we're going to be looking at is the Disney Lorcana Stockholm Open. Again, we're seeing a very high representation of Amber Steel in the top 8, so 3 Amber Steel decks. We also saw 3 Ruby Sapphire decks, and considering how many Amber Steel were at this event, it makes sense that Ruby Sapphire would do quite as well as it did. After that, we saw 1 Amber Amethyst deck list and also 1 Emerald Steel. So those were the top 8 breakdowns. Again, in that post-hire meta, we are seeing a lot of variety. And so with that said, let's jump on over to the deck list. And we're going to start off with the winning deck list from the Disney Lorcana Ravensburger 25 from Joel Shadeli. And this is Churner Dog list, an Amber Emerald Churner Dog list. And it's actually been interesting over the last few weeks covering the meta, seeing the trajectory and how this deck has been evolving. And I think one of the main things that we're seeing with these decks is that there is a really high concentration of one-cost characters. But actually, Joel here choosing to have maybe a fewer of those. Normally, these decks are running about 20 one-cost characters. This deck running only 18. But that allows Joel to have maybe a little bit of a stronger mid-game while still being able to achieve that goal of flooding the board early in order to be able to play your Tramp for cheaper and then ultimately get to your Churner Bog. One interesting, or a couple of interesting things to look at in this list, we do see 2 copies of Lady Miss Park Avenue. Because you are running 3 copies of the one-cost lady, she is a potential shift target, and a really good way to recur some of those high value characters like your Daisy Ducks, who you might want to play again after they've been banished. So very nice to see the inclusion there. We see 2 copies of Prince Philip, a really good card in a meta where there's a lot of direct removal because of his ward. He's protected from it, and he also dodges the big Sisu. And one of the things actually Joel said on Twitter, kind of reflecting on this deck, is he felt like Prince Philip and probably the Piglet he'd want to remove, and he said he would increase the copies of Gogo Tamago in a deck list like this where you don't really have any of that uninteractive lore. You're relying very much on questing. Having something like Gogo Tamago to be able to just close out a game if you lose board control is quite a useful tool to have, so that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, very good looking list. It's interesting. If you should watch his games for sure. Like, there were some very crazy board states where he had like 10 plus characters on board, which is fantastic. He also beat the likes of DKP at this event on his way to the top spot. So a very, very powerful deck, especially if you want to go for more of the aggressive route rather than maybe the control mid-range that we see a lot of in Disney Lorcana. So great job to Joel. Huge tournament, huge result. And honestly, it's so good to see a deck like Churner Dog, which is really new this set, doing as well as it's doing. And then if you want something a little spicier still, we have this winning list from the Lucky Llama Smackdown from Zan Sayed, who continues to be an innovator in the deck building space, always doing something interesting, always trying to break the meta, and is doing it here. Jafar Whole New World is a list I know a lot of people have been hoping could finally become a reality. A lot of sets have been spent trying to make this work, and it's always kind of fallen short, but maybe this is the set now that has all of the tools needed in order to make this Jafar list work. The main strategy, of course, with this is getting down your Jafar Striking Illusionist and then closing the game by drawing cards. How we're doing that is normally through things like Whole New World, being able to shift Jafar, sing Whole New World, and then immediately gaining a 7 lore. Very powerful indeed. But we also see things like Friends on the other side, another way to draw cards and gain that lore. But perhaps the most interesting inclusion is the Lamp, because you're running Jafars and you're also running Genies in this list. The Lamp can be doing double duty, drawing cards and returning your opponent's cards to their hand, which can be quite powerful. We also see the inclusion of the new Jafar with this set, the 3-2 questing for 2. He has very good stats. It's a little bit harder to remove with Ruby's removal like Brawl, so maybe he's going to stick around a little bit longer. But he's also an aggressive quester, so it gives you like another way to be gaining lore early on in the game. And then after that, we're seeing a lot of what we would expect in a lot of these Amethyst Steel lists. So we've got the Churnerbox Followers, the Diablo, the Pete, of course, a great card to be able to slow your opponent down and just kind of delay sometimes things like be prepared or even actions on your opponent's side, which is good because you do want to be protecting your Jafar in order to be getting his ability off multiple times. So I know a lot of people are going to be very excited about this. There's already been a massive buyout of Jafar Striking Illusionist cards on TCG Player. That seems to be the case whenever Zan Sayed puts up a good result with a deck list, then everyone jumps on those cards, which makes sense. He's a very good player, and it's great to see continued innovation even this far into the metagame for this set. Next up, we have a more traditional looking Amethyst Steel list. This is the list that took 3rd place at the Randolph Rosemont 2K, and it was Claude Aubert's list. This is the more aggressive version of the list featuring Doc. The game plan really is to be flooding the board and then refilling your hand with Doc to keep putting your opponent under a lot of pressure. Some interesting things to note in Claude's list is John Silver. 2 copies of John Silver, and he prevents your opponent being able to challenge when he's played. This is a fantastic card into the likes of Maui Half Shark, because it will then prevent your opponent being able to recur their actions. So definitely an interesting inclusion there. Something, of course, that can be bounced back with your snakes and your foxes to be able to get repeated uses out of him. We also see one copy of Bagheera, a card that we were very excited about at the beginning of the set that's maybe not doing as well as we had hoped, but still a very fun card in this list as well. And then after that, the kind of things you would imagine, the Calhoun's on turn 2 to kind of stave off your opponent's aggression, the Giant Cobra to help you close the game, and one copy of the library, a great way in these lists to draw a card. And then the next list we're going to look at, also from the Randolph Rosemont 2K that took top 8, and this is from Jonathan Defoy, a player I've actually had the opportunity to play with. He's a super nice guy, so great to see him putting in this good result. And this being the more mid-range version, the version that utilizes more songs. Strength of Raging Fire, of course, in all lists, but Along Came Zeus is the main difference here. And Jonathan actually has some quite fun picks in this list. The 3 copies of Tinkerbell Fast Flyer 1/3 questing for 2, but the evasive on her means you will hopefully be able to use her turn after turn to really put on the lore pressure there. 4 copies of Lawrence as well, a card that I really like. And 3 copies of Dolores Madrigal, being able to gain a card when she's played, and of course has very good stats as a 3/3 questing for 2. And one thing to note from Jonathan's list, he's very low on the uninkable counts, which is great. It's only 11 uninkables if my maths is correct, which means that, you know, very consistent list. You're not going to be getting hands that you're not able to play with very often. So definitely a great choice there. And yeah, great list from Jonathan. And then the list that took first place at the Rosemont 2K. This is from Pierre-Marc Duguay, aka Sailor, known for really innovating the Sisu on Ice list, but since the ban of Harem, Sailor has chosen to explore something maybe a little bit different, which is this Emerald Steel discard list. And in terms of the list itself, this is very much what we've come to expect from the Emerald Steel list this set. Really, the main new addition from Archazia's Island is that Pete, the 5/5 questing for 2 that prevents your opponent being able to sing songs. But then after that, we have many of the same things we'd expect. We've got the Diablos, which really are the cornerstone of this deck, being able to just draw you so many cards if your opponent's not able to answer them. The 4 copies of Prince John to really take advantage of all the discard that's going on, and of course cards like Ursula to help control the board, the Muses to also control the board, and we do see 1 copy of Pluto in this list. The interesting thing about Pluto is even if he's taken some damage, you can potentially then bounce him back to your hand with the Muses to then replay him later, so that can be a nice way to make sure that you keep maintaining his strength in the game. So yeah, super solid list here, and great job to Pierre-Marc for doing well at this tournament. And then the other winning list this weekend, this is the one that took first place at the Disney Lorcana Stockholm Open from Henrik Olsen, and it is Ruby Sapphire. This is the more DKP version of the list, focusing really on the Manas and Maui Half Shark as your win conditions. But we do see some innovation here and some modifications from that base list from DKP. The main things to call out here is 1 copy of Maui's Fishhook. This is an item that gives your characters evasive or Challenger +3, but it's also free to use if you have a character named Maui in play, and with 4 copies of Maui Demigod and 4 copies of Maui Half Shark, you're almost always going to be able to use the ability of this item. But it is a very good one in the current metagame where we do see quite a lot of evasive characters, being able to not have to sacrifice your own Maui Half Shark to take out another Maui Half Shark. We also see 2 copies of Hades in this deck list. Hades is a card we often associate more with Blurple lists, but he is starting to make an appearance in Ruby Sapphire lists with a lot of big characters, with a lot of Maui Half Sharks in the metagame. Having something to be able to remove them very efficiently and cleanly in the form of a card like Hades is going to be very impactful indeed for the game. And after that, much of what we'd expect to see. But we do also have 2 copies of Donald Duck Focus Flatfoot in this list, letting you increase your ink even further to really get to your late game as soon as you can. So great looking list here. And another Ruby Sapphire list I wanted to take a look at is also from the Stockholm Open. This is a top 8 list from Alex Phil, and looking quite a bit different from the previous list we looked at, and that is because of the inclusion of Bell Apprentice Inventor. Again, a card that tends to find itself more in Blurple decks these days, but because this player has chosen to run also 3 copies of Vitalosphere, it does mean that you're able to then hopefully get Bell out a lot more consistently. And of course, if you have to sack those items to play Bell, you can get them back with your Tamatoa happy as a clam. This player is also opting for 1 copy of Scar Vicious Cheetah, so no copies of Hades in this list. Maybe this player was anticipating more aggressive lists, and of course Scar is fantastic into those. And then after that, very similar to what we've seen, and again 1 copy of Maui's Fishhook. I'm really happy to see this item coming back because I do think it's a very good one to have in these lists. And I also wanted to highlight this list also took first place at the Content Creator Set Championships that happened in London, organized by Ravensburger. And this is Harlan Sweet's list. Harlan is an innovator in the Sapphire Steel space and actually one of the first people to kind of develop this more aggressive list. So he did take the first place at this event with other content creators featuring people like Kawa, featuring people like Alpha. So a lot of really great players there and really building on the core of this deck that was established last set. And you'll notice there are 0 cards from Archazia's Island in this list. It's really relying on those tried and true formulas. But I think this is a really good deck list to look at just because, you know, there are a lot of people out there who do love Sapphire Steel. And if you want to play Sapphire Steel, this is probably the best way to do it in the current metagame. So because this list is running the 7 Dwarfs Mine Train, we do see 4 copies of Happy. As I always mention, a really great way to help deal with Diablos, but is a very cheap character that can be put into the mine and deal the 2 damage. And then everything else in this list is very stock and standard of what we would expect at this point. But Harlan has gone up to 4 copies of Gantu, a great card against Ruby decks and helps you close the game. And against Steel decks, he can just be Ink, or if you get your cogs without, then he maybe will survive a little bit longer than he normally would. And speaking of deck innovators, this is the top 2 list from the Randolph Rosemont 2K from Xavier Provost, and actually a player I've had the pleasure of playing multiple times here in Montreal, always doing something interesting and off meta with his deck lists. So great to see him doing a really good result here at the Randolph Rosemont. Funnily enough, his brother Cedric also played in this tournament, played exactly the same 60 cards and took 4th place. So it shows you the consistency of this deck. But these brothers, very, very good players indeed. But amazing to see something a little bit spicier, a little bit off meta taking place. And this is an Amber Amethyst deck slanted more toward the mid-range. So yes, you have your early aggression, but this is a deck looking more to close the game in the mid-game. A card that has been seeing a lot of play recently, Peter Pan Shadow Finder. We see 4 copies in this list. Since we're running 4 copies of Genie and 4 copies of Iago, he is going to be there to give those evasive characters rush, which can then deal with your opponent's board. And we also see 4 copies of Madam Mim Tiny Adversary, giving all of your characters that little bit of extra strength. And that can actually be really useful when you've got characters like Daisy Duck in the deck. Being able to turn her into a 2/4 means she'll be able to take out more characters than she would normally. And because of her 4 willpower, then she is a great target with your Rapunzel. But I think what's probably the most different between this list and what we've seen from other Amethyst Amber lists in this space are the 3 copies of Bare Necessities, which are going to be a great way of kind of scouting ahead, seeing what your opponent has, but also removing problematic cards for this deck like Be Prepared, like Steel Removal, and 3 copies of World's Greatest Criminal Mind, helping deal with the more problematic cards on the other side of the board. Things like Maui Halfshark, but also the Emerald Steel Pete as well. So very happy to see a list like this doing well, especially at a large tournament. And again, congrats to Xavier and Cedric for both doing really, really well with this list. And then another Amber Amethyst list, now more aggro slanted than the one we just looked at. And this took top 8 at this Stockholm Open from Zacharias. One thing I did want to mention actually whilst looking at this list is actually the cheapest list that we're looking at today. Under $100 USD, which is very good for a meta deck. And it's certainly the one you might want to play if you prefer a more aggro strategy. So a lot more of the 1-cost characters than we saw in the previous list. In fact, we see 22 1-cost characters because the strategy, of course, with this list is going to be flooding the board. We also see 4 copies of Neverland that will withstand Sisu, will withstand Be Prepared as well. So a little bit protection in those cases. And then because this deck is going to be quite fragile, we do have that non-interactive law gain that we would expect. Honey Marin, 2 copies of Honey Marin, he'll gain you law on play. 4 copies of Baloo, a card that will gain you 2 law when banished, whilst also protecting your characters. And then 4 copies of Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom, 2 This Is My Family as well. Very fun looking list if you prefer a more hyper aggro way of playing. And before we move on to the next list, I just want to give a huge shout out to the sponsors of today's video, Heavy Play. Heavy Play have their Equip mag system, which allows you to connect your deck box to your dice box and your playmat, all with the power of magnets. Makes it super easy to switch between tables when you're playing. They also have their curved sleeves with curved corners, which make it easy to shuffle, but also mean you'll never have a card upside down in your deck again. If you want to get your hands on any Heavy Play products before your next big tournament, then you can visit them at heavyplay.com and use the discount code Inkborn10 at checkout in order to get 10% off your whole order. Next now we're going to look at the second place list from the Lucky Llama Smackdown from Worlds Qualifier Mo Shamblin here, and this is an Amethyst Emerald bounce list. So we had been seeing the more discard oriented approach for this list, but Mo's list is more focused on that tempo playstyle instead, and it is looking like a little bit of a blast from the past. We don't see any new cards from Archazia's Island, really building on the core that was established throughout the previous sets. Cards in here that I really like, so Lyle Tiberius Rock, such a fun card, a good way to slow your opponent down if they race ahead, reducing their law by 1 every time one of your characters is banished. We also see the Clarabelle package, 3 copies of the 1-cost Clarabelle, and also 4 copies of the 7-cost Clarabelle light on her hoofs. A great way to refill your hand after you've flooded the board with your own characters. And then we have other things we would expect in this list. 3 copies of the library, a great way to both draw cards but also be resistant to Be Prepared and other board wipes. 4 copies of the Go-Go Tamago, a great way again to close out the game with this deck list. And then a little bit of disruption and removal in the form of 3 copies of Kit Cloud Kicker and also 2 copies of Mother Knows Best. Great job to Mo for taking second place at this event. I held off as long as I could, but let's look at the most represented ink pairing this week, and that is Amber Steel, and specifically Amber Steel's songs doing particularly well in the current metagame now that Sapphire has been weakened a little bit. So the best performing Amber Steel list this weekend was this second place list from Hans Skarin, who was at the Stockholm Open, and looking like a very traditional Amber Steel songs list. Funnily enough, this is pretty much identical to the list I'm currently playing, so it is good for me to see that it is doing well at tournaments. And really not much else to say, just a very, very solid list, and great job to Hans Skarin for doing super well with this. A slightly spicier list now from Simeon Lajoie, who was top 8 at the Randolph Rosemont 2K. And for those who watched the video last week, you might remember this name. Simeon actually took top 4 at the face-to-face tournament, also in Montreal. And his list has developed since then. So if you remember, he was actually running 65 cards last time. So he has got his deck list down to a nice round 60 cards. I know a lot of people like that. The main changes here being removing the Pluto as well as another couple of cards, but still the core is there. This deck using the Lantern to be able to get out those 5-cost characters sooner, and this deck list also using Stitch, Carefree Surfer, a card that I absolutely love to see. And then because there's such variety in Amber Steel songs, this is a top 8 deck list from the Stockholm Open from Cement. And this is the deck list using the Queen Shift line. This is very, very similar to the Kurt Spice list that did really well at the Legendary Cross-Continental Challenge run by Pavel of Pixelborn fame. And this list doing very well, again, a very consistent list, especially into Ruby matchups, being able to disrupt your opponent with the Queen on turn 2, singing Whole New World can be devastating for a lot of decks and really mess up their mulligan strategy. So yeah, again, not much to say, not much development on this list, just a very solid list continuing to do well. But for those who want a little bit more spice in your Steel song, here's the list for you. This is a Steel song list using the Floodborn Simba, but not the Floodborn Simba you might expect. This deck list is using 2 copies of Simba, son of Mufasa, who when played can banish an item or can banish a location. And I can tell you, as a Steel song player, I dread when my opponent plays a Muktuk mana, and here is a card that's going to help you deal with that a lot more efficiently. Also 1 copy of the Bare Necessity, so you can get to that Muktuk mana before your opponent ever has an opportunity to play it. After that, we see a lot of the regular cards in here. We see the 4 Cinderellas, the 4 Troubadours, and the 4 Ariels, there to really help you set up that early board of singers that can then deal with your opponent's side of the board whilst you continue to build your own. We see 1 copy of Aurora Dreaming Guardian, a card that I really had hoped would do well this set, but it's still struggling to find its place. But 1 copy there. She does have some very nice synergy with Rapunzel, allowing you to ready her and then sing those songs again. Next, we're going to look at Amethyst Sapphire. I know this is a very popular color combination for a lot of players, and this is the deck list that took 3rd place at the Lucky Llama Smackdown from Flying Dragon Turtle, and continuing to build and innovate in this deck. The main changes, of course, this set are the 4 copies of Popsicle, 4 copies of Bell. Really helps this deck deal with your opponent's boards when going wider. This deck also running 4 copies of Iago. He's been great when paired with Peter Pan Shadowfinder to give him rush, but in this list, because you're able to accelerate your Ink on turn 2, it means you're actually playing him a turn sooner than you would. So even without the Peter Pan Shadowfinder, he can still have quite a big impact on the board state. After that, we see 3 copies of Gaston, Intellectual Powerhouse, a great card to help you dig for those answers, something like a McDuck Manor to play following a Be Prepared, always a great play there. 1 copy of Tamatoa, Happy as a Clam to get those Popsicles back that have either been banished to play Bell or just been used to heal your characters, and 3 copies of Finders Keepers as well to help with the card draw. So great looking list here and great result. And then another list to look at is this one from the Randolph Rosemont 2K, took top 8, and it's Etienne Germain, and another name you might remember from the face-to-face tournament last week. And really the main change from this list from his previous list is the removal of the 2 copies of Anna Icebreaker, and then the additions we see a 1 copy of Elsa the Fifth Spirit, a great card to lock down your opponent's board and stall them to be able to win the game, and also 2 copies of Hypnotic Strength. This is a card that's starting to find a place in these Amethyst lists as a great way to deal with your opponent's illusions and also a way to draw a card as well. And then let's look at the other most represented deck list this week. This is Ruby Amethyst, and we're going to start off with this top 4 list at the lucky Llama Smackdown from Firecracker 91, and this is the more evasive heavy build. Because of that, we have the 3 copies of Peter Pan Shadowfinder. You've got evasives in this deck list like Pegasus, like Iago, and Peter Pan is going to give them rush. So it makes something like Pegasus, which kind of can become kind of useful later in the game, but being able to rush out a 3-cost evasive is quite a good thing to do. Here we do see the pairing with Iago, and we've also got Maui Halfshark. Being able to give Maui Halfshark rush the turn he's played means he's doing something as soon as he hits the board, allowing you to get your actions back. 2 copies of Pirate's Life here to gain Law and drain your opponent's Law, 2 copies of Finders Keepers, and only 2 copies of Brawl because you are looking to get those back with your Mauis. And then this play going for a split of 2 Sisus and 2 Be Prepared to help deal with your opponent's board. And we also see 1 copy of Maui's Fishhook in this list, and actually has some really fun synergy with Peter Pan Shadowfinder because you can use the hook to give a character evasive, and then that character will immediately have rush if Peter Pan Shadowfinder is on the board. So yeah, very fun looking list, and one I know Mattis is quite excited to try out himself. And then the more traditional looking Ruby Amethyst list is going to be our last list today. Also took top 8 at the lucky Llama Smackdown from Yerdboy, and yeah, the much more traditional list. This is a list less favoring those evasive characters and is relying instead more on cards that replace themselves, things like Cusco and Diablo, so that your opponent is under pressure because of that. And then we actually see 7 locations in this list, so 4 copies of the library, which is kind of what we'd expect in Ruby Amethyst, but we're also seeing 3 copies of the Queen's Castle as well. I'm actually a huge fan of this location. It has dropped out of the metagame because we do have a lot of very high strength characters, but it is a location that can put a lot of law pressure on your opponent and can draw you cards if you're able to set it up. And that is it for another week of the Meta Report, with set championships coming next week. Hopefully some of those lists have given you some inspiration, but let us know down in the comments what you are planning to take to your set championships. And if you're still on the fence or you're still undecided, we will be putting out our top 8 best decks for set championships hopefully this week. It's a little bit crazy in our lives at the moment because we're selling our house, so we've always got to be dealing with that, but I will try and get that video out to you as soon as I possibly can. So be sure to hit the subscribe button so that you're notified when that happens, and give us a like as it does help us out. Once more, a huge shout out to the sponsors of this video, Heavy Play. Remember, you can grab your Heavy Play products at heavyplay.com and use the discount code Inkborn10 at checkout to get 10% off your order. And finally, a last shout out to our YouTube members. We really appreciate all of the support. It helps motivate us to keep making videos like this. If you are interested in becoming a YouTube member or just want to find out the details, you can hit the join button down below to get all of the details. And until next time, I'm wishing you the best of luck at your set championships and happy questing.